So it's now my great pleasure to welcome Octavia Calder-Dawe, who is a doctoral student in the School of Psychology. Her PhD is within the context of the Marsden Grant, but not to do with pornography. She's working with young people, sexism and consciousness raising around sexism and that kind of thing. So she's going to talk to you about one aspect of her research today, speaking out, keeping cool, choreographies of everyday sexism.
Thank you. It's a great privilege to be here today, and I've really enjoyed the talks that we've had so far, as I'm sure you all have too. And I hope that what I have to say will kind of fit in and resonate with some of what we've heard already in an interesting way. I'd like to begin with a story that a research participant told me. She was walking home from school, and on her way she passed a group of guys sitting on a ledge by a footpath. As she came nearer, one of them called out to her, "Are you a vegan?" As it happens, she is a vegan. So she replied enthusiastically, "Yes, are you a vegan too?" It wasn't until the speaker repeated his question that she realized she had made a mistake. What he actually said was, "Are you a virgin?" In this moment of comprehension, the interaction is transformed. My participant recognizes what is happening as sexual harassment and knows where the interaction will go from here. I suspect that you all have some sense as well of what will happen next. We can picture what happens next because once entered into, sexist interactions tend to be confined to a few predictable moves and counter moves. Sexist exchanges have their own choreography, a hard-to-resist flow that channels the interaction in some directions and not in others. The choreography of everyday sexism is the focus of my presentation today. I argue that sexism is easily done and hard to challenge, as we've heard in the talks presented so far. To understand why, I want to spotlight its choreography, how sexism is organized, achieved, and resisted. I also want to examine the logics that hold this choreography in place. But before wading in, why talk about sexism now? Well, sexism, the manifold practices and beliefs that function to subordinate women, seems to have gradually fallen out of public and political consciousness over the past 30 years in the wake of some feminist gains. Today, talk about sexism attracts little interest, and indeed the very idea of sexism as an enduring force seems to lack credibility. As Judith Williamson argues, increasingly our culture presents sexism as a kind of 60s or 70s phenomenon to be enjoyed as kitsch rather than as a contemporary problem to be addressed as unjust. I think this picture from Moa Beer's I said advertising campaign, it's actually their investors' prospectus, which is perhaps a little worse, captures Judith Williamson's point perfectly. So why this silence about sexism? It's certainly not because sexism has ground to a halt. Whether you're talking about gender-based violence, street harassment, public and private policing of women's bodies, employment or economic indicators, sexism and gendered inequalities are absolutely with us. Well, one factor in this silence about sexism is the proliferation of post-feminist discourse. Angela McRobbie describes post-feminism as a new kind of anti-feminism. Post-feminism claims that the battle for gender equality is won and that any lingering inequalities are of little consequence. This claim makes sexism hard to articulate. The word sexism, the possibility of sexism, are consigned to the past. As Ros Gill argues, sexism becomes unspeakable. compounding this unspeakability is the fact that under post-feminism, sexism can be done in new ways that are even more difficult to pinpoint. Alongside the bald misogyny of bro culture come new forms of enlightened, ironic, and retro sexism. Like the new racism, new sexism subordinates and diminishes women while appearing unproblematic, light-hearted, even progressive. Under post-feminism, sexism is organised around a kind of plausible deniability, making it very hard to challenge, but more on this later on. So the unspeakability of sexism is part of what enables it to flourish. In order to challenge sexism, we need to find ways of labelling it and making those labels stick. We need to start thinking and talking about sexism again. Speaking about sexism and seeing what happens is a nutshell summary of my thesis research on which this talk is based. My supervisors over here, and I designed a project that we hope will give young people a chance to try out a critical vocabulary for naming and challenging sexism. To do this, I ran 3-day and 1-day participatory workshops with 23 young people from 5 central Auckland schools. The workshops offered participants a space to reflect on their own everyday experiences in light of a critical feminist analysis of gender, sexuality, sexism, and power. I also ran 20 individual follow-up interviews sometime later to see what this critical analysis was offering participants down the line. The analysis that I present today is drawn from those follow-up interviews. So participants had the option of supplying some kind of free format demographic information at the start of the workshop. And as you can see, they wrote what they wanted if they wanted to. And I've represented the range of responses to 4 criteria here with counts in brackets. Just a side note, because of some unusual combinations, I've counted compound ethnicities, so for instance, Japanese and Polish as 2, so the counts don't quite add up for that reason, and that's to protect anonymity. But let's turn back to the questions that I raised at the beginning. First off, what happened when young people involved in my project had a chance to start thinking and talking about sexism? Well, most relished the opportunity. A critical analysis offered participants something useful, a way to make sense of niggly feelings, to articulate why certain things felt wrong or bothered them. It also made invisible sexism visible. And Alan explains, I was like, oh, there is actually quite a lot of things I hadn't thought about before that I just kind of accepted, like things like, well, street heckling and stuff like that. So with a sharpened vocabulary and sharpened eyes, what kinds of sexism did participants see around them? Well, a whole lot of things. Routine jokes undermining women's capacity and trivializing rape, sexual harassment, surveillance of women's bodies, punitive expectations about feminine character and behavior. Let me just have a stretch. And a pervasive sense of dismissiveness, particularly intellectual dismissiveness towards women and girls. Some participants identified these instances of sexism with ease. Other times, participants hesitated over contestable little things that they found harder to pin down, like rape jokes and sandwich jokes. If you're unsure, the sandwich joke is this. Women and girls are told jokingly by a guy, "Go make me a sandwich." And the joke or tease is the implication that women and girls belong in the kitchen. So Kate explains, it's got that insinuation that it's because you're a woman and you belong in the kitchen. Yeah. Sandwich jokes are dismissive, implying that women should get back to the kitchen. But this ironic sexism passes as a joke. Sandwich jokes are mostly directed at women, but they can be used against guys too, as Thomas explains. If a guy is doing something feminine, my friends can sometimes be like, go bake me a sandwich, like associating it as him being a girl, so he should make me a sandwich. This is a kind of double whammy. It jokingly consigns women to the kitchen, while also diminishing this particular young man for being a girl. So what is the choreography of these kind of instances of sexism? How do they work interactionally? Well, almost every interaction participants described was choreographed around the plausible deniability of sexism. That is, a person's capacity to do sexism while plausibly denying that anything genuinely sexist has taken place. Plausible is the operative word here. The success and the acceptability of sexism depend on its legibility as playful, as complimentary, as not serious. So an insistence that gender equality has been achieved enables sexism to be read in this way, as harmless. In everyday interactions, plausible deniability licenses speech that might otherwise be challenged as sexism. This choreography protects the speaker against charges of sexism. You've simply misread the situation, and sexist comments, jokes, and actions can flow unchecked. Accusations of sexism may be easily deflected, but relations of power are still reinscribed through playful disparagement and complimentary sexualization. Plausible deniability sets the choreography of sexism, making routine diminishment and derivatization of women and girls very difficult to name and to disrupt. This is the violence of plausible deniability. Sexism retains its power without appearing to have any. So what did participants make of all this that they were seeing around them? Well, participants described a strong desire to challenge and change things. So Manaya says, the things that people say and the things that people do, I'll just realize how sexist things are. And it has really created a will for me to want to change those things, really want it to be different to how it is. How does this desire translate into action? Well, that brings us to my title, Speaking Out, Keeping Cool. Participants experienced an uncomfortable tension between the impulse to speak out and challenge sexism and the need to keep cool. There is a double sense to the phrase keeping cool. Keeping cool means keeping calm, logical, not losing one's head. But keeping cool is also about coolness, maintaining the esteem of others. The two are distinct but related. Get fired up about sexism and you risk losing respect. The difficulty of speaking out while keeping cool is in part an effect of the choreography of sexism I've just discussed. Because sexism is sheltered by plausible deniability, any attempt to label something as sexist can be dismissed by turning the accusation back on the speaker, who is positioned as humorless, as overreacting, as oversensitive, someone who has failed to keep their cool. For some participants, this choreography made it feel like there was no winning, no way of offering a challenge to sexism that would be taken into account. So Ellen says, you turn around and get angry? Oh, it was just a compliment. You keep walking, they keep doing it. It's like there's no winning, you know? To get out of this impasse, participants develop strategies for challenging sexism without sacrificing their cool. One strategy is to raise the issue of sexism in a way that is not aggressive. Rather than telling someone off, participants gently suggested alternatives. Mia takes this approach. I don't want to force it on anybody else. I might be like, oh, you should check this out, or something, but I won't be like, this is what you should think. This strategy allows the speaker to challenge sexism delicately, raising critique in a manner that couldn't be reasonably understood as anything more than an invitation to check out another perspective. There are fairly evident limitations to this strategy. First, it is only available in situations where one might reasonably expect to be listened to. And so it's not of much use with street heckling, for instance. Second, there is nowhere to go if others dismiss or don't even notice your sensitively presented critique. Selena describes getting stuck in this way. Yeah, you're kind of stuck. You hit a kind of wall where you're like, okay, if I say any more, I'm just going to have to disagree with you. Bound to a strategy of calm respect that makes a direct challenge impossible, participants found themselves having to let sexism pass. Another strategy for challenging sexism while keeping cool is to reply in kind with a joking rebuttal. This approach was most commonly used in response to the flood of sexist jokes participants encountered. Thomas gleefully described a friend's comeback to her boyfriend. So Joe said, "Go make me a sandwich," and Joe's girlfriend responded with, "I'll make you a sandwich if you make me a table." Responding with humour rather than anger allows participants to playfully rebut sexism while showing that they get the joke. Kumiko adopts this strategy with her brother, and she explains why. I think when you confront him or make a serious comment about why that's sexism, he will say something like, "I was joking," or "it's just having fun." And I don't know. It's phrased as a joke, and I'm taking it lightly as well. I still think it's sexism. The problem with this strategy is that it is complicit in the positioning of sexism as a joking matter. Kumiko means what she says, but her joking tone implies that she is taking it lightly. While it offers protection from accusations of overreacting or failing to get the joke, this strategy makes participants complicit in a construction of sexism as no big deal. And in the end, it lets sexist jokers off the hook. Another thing to note is that these strategies for keeping cool about sexism involve considerable emotional labour for participants. In order to avoid the possibility of being labelled as humourless or overreacting, they must face whatever treatment they encounter in sexist interactions with calm, including being shut down by others, a phrase that came up again and again, and an experience that Ellen explains like this. It's embarrassing, it's humiliating, it makes you feel like you're not worth it, it makes you feel like your opinions aren't worth it. You still know you're right, but then you can't express that, so it's also frustrating. Now, these are strong feelings. Given the costs involved, why do participants feel so bound to keep cool and avoid any chance of being labelled angry or oversensitive? I imagine that there are parents here today who know from experience that teenagers don't hold back in other contexts. So, what is it about the choreography of sexism that makes keeping cool so vital? Well, I noticed something reading through the interview transcripts. Across the board, young women were concerned with keeping their cool. And yet, for the 4 young men I talked to, it wasn't as big a deal. So is there a further gendered dynamic at play on top of the workings of plausible deniability? I want to argue that sexist representations of feminists are what hold the dominant choreography of sexism in place. Losing one's cool in a sexist interaction comes at a high price for female participants. It makes them legible as the wrong kind of woman. Humorless, ball-breaking, unfeminine, feminist. Negative caricatures of feminists are well rehearsed. Sarah Ahmed assembles typical sexist claims about feminists into the figure of the feminist killjoy. The feminist killjoy ruins things. She finds fault. She is oversensitive, PC, and bitter. She is irrationally and inappropriately angry, and she embodies failed femininity. Women, but not men, risk being positioned as feminist killjoys when they speak out about sexism. When this positioning succeeds, the speaker's challenge to sexism is dismissed as baseless, and the speaker herself is diminished as bitter, ranting, unfeminine. This is a sexist power play that participants did not want to experience. The feminist killjoy is a haunting presence in my young women participants' talk. I see her in their insistence that the catalogues of sexism they describe are not a big deal. I see her in their desire to not be a buzzkill. Take Kate's comment. If you say something against sexism, then you're just a killjoy, or they say, I was only joking, so you don't want to be that person. The feminist killjoy is that person, that woman, who no one wants to be. This spectre not only haunts these conversations, she comes to life in them. Thomas explains how the accusation of being a feminist can be used to discipline and silence young women. So guys could easily just attack a female with feminism, and she couldn't really respond. Along similar lines, Jin Hee tells me that she wouldn't want to talk about sexism to a whole bunch of guys because they could make what she says invalid. I feel as if they could use so many excuses that could make my point invalid, like the period stuff and stuff like that, and you're just a feminist, stuff like that. To react as a feminist is to disrupt good feeling. The feminist killjoy is a problem person who sees sexism everywhere it isn't, and in doing so, creates trouble for others. Worse, by putting her own feelings first, she hurts others by misreading their good intentions and labeling them sexist. In short, the feminist killjoy causes injury rather than speaking about it. This has a powerful rhetorical effect. It deflects attention away from the harm of sexism towards the harm that is inflicted when sexism is challenged. Participants described again and again how their careful attempts to challenge sexism were read as unfair personal attacks or attempts to bring others down. The figure of the feminist killjoy is even more abject in light of individualizing meritocratic discourses that position individuals as self-determining. The idea that those who work hard succeed. This claim takes on gender dimensions in talk about sexism. For if gender equality has been achieved, then the only people likely to be complaining about sexism are those who want someone else to blame for their failure. The shamefulness of speaking about disadvantage has come to stick to the feminist killjoy. She is not only a harbinger of nightmarish PCism, but also rather pathetic in her transparent attempts to pin her woes to other people. Even talking with me, recounting examples of sexism, young women participants spoke with care to avoid this position. In summary, I suggest that the feminist killjoy is not simply an effect of sexism. She is part of what makes sexism difficult to challenge. Her presence shapes the choreography of sexism. The threat of being cast as a feminist killjoy compels young women participants to keep cool, holding their critiques of sexism in check. So where to from here? Well, Sarah Ahmed suggests that the best way around the feminist killjoy is to embrace her, to relish being inappropriately affected by sexism. Ahmed explains, whilst hearing feminists as killjoys might be a form of dismissal, there is an agency that this dismissal rather ironically reveals. We can respond to the accusation with a yes. Speaking out defiantly as a feminist killjoy is a fertile move, but I'm interested in another possibility too. What other strategies exist that might allow us to jam up the whole choreography of sexism? Well, let's return to the anecdote that I shared at the start of this talk, that moment of miscomprehension. In that moment, her failure to hear virgin was their failure to do sexism. The whole choreography of sexism wobbled. And this wobble is a reminder that sometimes sexism depends on a particular kind of participation or recognition to function. Hearing vegan, not virgin, is an act of creative correction that plays havoc with the choreography of sexism. What would happen if we took up these opportunities for creative correction when we feel able? Hearing vegan, not by accident, but on purpose. Perhaps a creative response might disorganize sexism as effectively as speaking out. And importantly, it could be a whole lot more fun. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And my question was, where to from here for you and the work you've done with young people? Are you in touch with them? Are they inspired by your lead?
I haven't kept in touch with the group that I've been working with, but I had the opportunity of going back to them after the workshop to do the follow-up interviews, but not since then. But I hope they are, and I think from the way that some of them talked about, just having access to a space to get in touch with critical ideas and try them out was quite transformative for them, as it was for me going through university, and I think as it is for a lot of people. Yeah.
Did any of the young men you interview propose possible strategies or solutions for disorganizing sexism?
Yeah, so different kinds. I mean, again, these weren't necessarily articulated as strategies. That's sort of my version of what they were saying. So one guy felt he was quite confident being different. So he would just go up to his friends, do you think it's okay to say that? Why? Here's what I think. So that was his strategy, and he felt confident doing that. Another guy talked about speaking out, and people didn't really attack him personally for doing that, but they were just not interested. He'd say something and people would just change the subject immediately.
Hey, thanks for that. That was a lot of fun and really informative. I actually hope you create some sort of pamphlet or something to distribute, because I think knowing those tropes would be very helpful for a lot of people. One strategy which I'm trying to work on and doing more of is almost a divide and conquer approach, which is after the effect, finding people, or even when I've done something which I think is maybe a bit sexist or wrong, and afterwards either going and apologizing or going and kind of on a one-on-one approach, having a conversation after the effect, where it's no longer the big social situation where it's all occurring, and trying to create a safe space where it's okay to talk about things and try and work out new strategies.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it can be even more difficult in a large group situation to bring in anything new or to raise issues. And a one-on-one approach is definitely a really valuable one. Yeah, and that was something participants talked about as well. They would pick their time if they wanted to speak out about something. They wouldn't do it to in front of a group of hostile people, but maybe a friend or, yeah.
One of the more hilarious strategies that I've been seeing circulating around my friends is getting sexists to explain their logic. It's hilarious. Someone makes a rape joke and you go, sorry, I don't understand. Why is that funny? And you put the ball in their court, and because it doesn't make sense, because it just, you end up, allowing people to see that sexism is just, I suppose, nonsensical, and they sort of expose themselves, and it takes the responsibility away from feminists who then get attacked all the time. It's particularly fun in family situations, because yes, then you have everyone trying to justify it, and yes.
Right, that sounds great. No, yeah.
And has the benefit of getting the perpetrator to kill and enjoy themselves.
Absolutely, and yeah, not understanding is really powerful. It's a great thing to do. And wouldn't it be great if we got to a point where if someone shouted out, "Are you a virgin?" we wouldn't get what they were trying to do.
And I wondered if you had any examples of young women talking about trying to balance and hold that with each other as peers, or how they respond to each other's responses. Does that make sense?
So is that sort of how you would respond to hearing a friend talking about what they did?
Yeah, or like a way of normalising and being able to hold a whole spectrum of responses from what might look like passivity or whatever, and what might look like a hilarious, raging joke, kind of being able to be supportive and stand in that space.
I mean, I think my sense is that, just based on this, that there aren't actually that many spaces to talk about stuff like street harassment. That's not necessarily something that people experience and don't even think about. So it's not like there's necessarily a lot of judgment going on about how that situation's being handled. It's just not even really being recognised as a situation to handle, But yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to not kind of say, this is what you should be doing, but just think about a range of options that might be appropriate in different situations. Yeah.